4. The Economics of Sabbath-Keeping by Gary North. 6 days shall work be done, but on the 7th day there shall be to you an holy day, a Sabbath of rest to the Lord. Whosoever doeth work therein shall be put to death. Ye shall kindle no fire throughout your habitations upon the Sabbath day. Exodus chapter 35, verses 2 and 3. One of the very few Old Testament ceremonial ordinances that contemporary Christians still claim to respect is the Sabbath. Usually, the defense of a required rest on the Sabbath is made in terms of the creation ordinance argument, and not simply in terms of the fourth commandment. Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 to 11. It is argued that God rested on the 7th day of the creation, and this serves as an example to be followed by all people in all cultures. God's covenant people are especially required to abstain from all secular employment on Sunday. No profits are legitimate that are made on Sunday. Only those people who work in occupations that offer aid to those in some emergency, or the people who enforce public law, are allowed to labour on the Sabbath. This would include doctors, policemen, firemen, soldiers who are on duty, and emergency telephone operators. Why these people should accept payment for these services is seldom explained. Christ defended the right of a man to pull a beast of burden out of a ditch, but he did not say men should operate beast retrieval companies for profit on the Sabbath. Puritan preachers sometimes saw this more clearly. Thomas Gouge, a contemporary of Owen and Baxter in 17th century England, praised as shining examples several Christian physicians who refused payment for Sunday labour. Despite their official appeals to the creation ordinance argument, modern Sabbatarians invariably appeal also to specific Old Testament passages to support their interpretation of the requirements for Sabbath observance. The same verses as cited by the Westminster Confession of Faith and the larger Catechism in the annotations are used today, over 3 centuries later. Isaiah chapter 58, verse 13 is a common reference, as is Jeremiah chapter 17, verses 21 to 27. It never seems to disturb them that these, quote, Hebrew, end quote, applications of the Sabbath came comparatively late in the English Reformation. Sabbatarianism had been a minor part of medieval Catholicism, and what rigour was asserted in theory by Catholic commentators was opposed vehemently by the Lollards and Luther. They were not willing to countenance anything which magnified the authority of the Roman Church. Calvin followed the tradition laid by Irenaeus and Augustine, interpreting the Sabbath as an allegory of the believer's rest in Christ from the bondage of sin, a rest to be made perfect in eternity. This, of course, was simply the teaching of Hebrews chapter 4, and Calvin was unwilling to break from its perspective. He went lawn bowling after church on Sunday, a fact which later Sabbatarians have chosen to ignore. The Church of England took a position midway between the Lutheran and the Catholic positions. It denounced superstitious celebrations, but reserved Sunday as a day of rest, although recreations of many sorts were considered legitimate, to the horror of later Puritans. It was only in the 1590s that the Anglicans, reacting against rigorous Puritan Sabbatarians, drifted back in the direction of the Roman Church with its holiday rests on certain saints' days. Professor Knappen, the foremost authority on Puritanism in England during the 16th century, has therefore come to this conclusion. Modern English Sabbatarianism is therefore not Reformed or Calvinistic in its origins. So far as it had any theoretical background, it is to be found in the medieval doctrine which survived in Anglican teaching and legislation, that the day was to be devoted wholly to religious ends. This remained the official doctrine of the Church under Elizabeth, as set forth in homily, catechism, and injunction. But the Queen's conduct did not conform to such standards. By permitting her churchmen to perpetuate a high doctrine on the subject and then flouting it, Elizabeth invited a reaction which eventually took the form of an even higher doctrine. The reaction, according to Nappen, began when the Paris Garden bear-baiting pit collapsed on Sunday, January the 19th, 1583, and killed 8 people. Reverend John Field took up the gauntlet and blamed this event on the violation of the Sabbath, equating the Christian Sabbath with the Hebrew Sabbath, an altogether new idea. Others then followed his lead. The hostility to any form of recreation on the Sabbath is manifested in many Puritan works of the last decade of the 16th century, notably Nicholas Downes' Doctrine of the Sabbath, 1595, and Richard Greenham's Treatise of the Sabbath, 1592. The Puritan position absolutely commanded labour on the 6 days of the week, and absolutely forbade any sort of amusement on the first day. The extent of their hostility to anything resembling a 5-day workweek is reflected in a statute that appears in the May 11th, 1659 minutes of the General Court of Massachusetts, one of the few political jurisdictions that Puritans ever controlled. For preventing disorders arising in several places within this jurisdiction, by reason of some still observing such festivals as were superstitiously kept in other countries, to the great dishonour of God and offence of others, it is therefore ordered by this court, and the authority thereof, that whosoever shall be found observing any such day as Christmas or the like, either by forbearing of labour, feasting, or any other way, upon such accounts as aforesaid, every such person offending shall pay for every such offence 5 shillings, as a fine to the county. The larger catechism, hammered out between 1643 and 1647 by the Westminster Assembly, is straightforward enough. It prohibits all profaning the day by idleness, and doing that which is in itself sinful, and by all needless works, words, and thoughts about our worldly employments and recreations. Answer 119. The defence of such Sunday rigour is made with numerous Old Testament citations. In his chapter on The Uses of Sabbatarianism, the English historian Christopher Hill comments, some of the extremes to which later Sabbatarianism resorted arose from a belief in the literal inspiration of the Bible and the equation of Sunday with the Jewish Sabbath. But these extreme views came later, after the hierarchy had broken with the virtual unanimity of early Elizabethan times on the subject of Sunday observance. The coming of strict Sabbatarianism cannot be separated from the political and ecclesiastical conflicts in England from 1590 to 1660. The modern Sabbatarian who is ignorant of the origins of his peculiar heritage has failed to see the extent of his deviation from the Augustinian Calvinistic tradition. What modern Sabbatarians generally argue is that the so-called purely ceremonial aspects of the Sabbath were temporary. This includes the very foundation of Hebrew Sabbath worship, namely the penalty for all violations, the death sentence. The fact that enforcement was absolutely and invariably connected to the observance of the Sabbath disturbs our contemporary rigorists not in the slightest. More rigorous than the New Testament would permit, the modern Sabbatarian is nevertheless too humanistic to let anything like fixed Old Testament law interfere with his lax view of the Sabbath enforcement. No exegetical argumentation is offered to explain why the unity of Old Testament Sabbath observance and enforcement can be broken. It is simply taken for granted. Sabbatarians merely assume that God is somehow honoured by their own inconvenience on Sundays, while a violation of his specific Sabbath enforcement provisions simultaneously brings him much glory. Equally, quote, ceremonial, end quote, are the debt provisions of the Sabbath years, in which all slaves were to be freed and all debts cancelled in the 7th year. The land was to go uncultivated as well. So we find self-proclaimed strict Sabbatarians who are in debt for 7 times 7 years, or who mine the soil unmercifully. Nevertheless, they pride themselves on their rigour. Their claim rests on the fact that they are not employed for profit on Sundays, and they do not watch the Green Bay Packers play the Cleveland Browns on television. Some of them will not listen to a news broadcast or read the Sunday newspaper. And the truly holy among them do not read the Monday morning issue either, knowing that it was printed on Sunday. Naturally, the Monday morning Sabbatarian quarterbacks, who at least enjoy reading about the Packers-Browns game, even though it is immoral to watch it or play it, resent the rigour of their fellow Sabbatarians who refuse to read the Monday afternoon account of it. The morning edition, as I have already mentioned, goes unread. They think of the others as legalists, while extremists who follow the implications of their position naturally view their weaker brethren as latent antinomians. Such is the way of men. He who resents getting his toes stepped on calls his brother a legalist. He who delights in stepping resents all others' obvious inconsistency. It is too often a question of whose ox is getting gored, or, to fulfill the analogy, whose ox has fallen into what ditch. What are the implications of Sabbath-keeping? It no doubt meant much more to the ancient Hebrew culture than any one of us can realize. In the modern world, we would find the full enforcement of the Sabbath rest, as practiced in ancient Israel, enormously disruptive of our familiar patterns of living. Thus, I have chose to limit my inquiry to only the most obvious implications for the single sphere of economics. This narrow focus in no way covers the sweeping impact of the Old Testament Sabbath provisions for other spheres of human society: family, government, military, and so forth. In any case, the implications of Sabbath observance for the narrow realm of economic affairs should be disconcerting enough for those who like to think of themselves as strict Sabbatarians. Hopefully, they will be forced to reconsider either their actions or their definition of the Sabbath as it applies to our age. The passage which introduced this essay, Exodus chapter 35, verses 2 and 3, sets forth the general provisions for the enforcement of the Hebrew Sabbath. It was a capital crime to kindle sticks on the Sabbath. Orthodox commentators have taken two basic views on this passage. First, that kindle must have referred to the starting of a fire, literally and figuratively, from scratch. It was a difficult task to light up a fire once it had gone out, and this constituted extra labour which could have been avoided merely by paying attention to the home fire, which should have been started the day before. The second view holds that kindle refers to a fire used in business, such as in the case of a blacksmith. The latter view is singularly unconvincing. A third possibility, that no fires were going in Israel, even in the cold of winter, is unlikely, especially in the light of Jesus' liberal interpretation of Sabbath observance. Matthew chapter 12, verse 1 following. Thus, it seems reasonable to assume that it was illegal to start a fire on the Sabbath, but legitimate to keep yesterday's fire burning. The case presented in Numbers chapter 15 should be interpreted in this light. A prohibition against starting a fire had to apply equally to the gathering of materials that might be used in kindling such a blaze. God made it plain to the Hebrews that such an extension of the general principle was required. And while the children of Israel were in the wilderness, they found a man that gathered sticks upon the Sabbath day. And they that found him gathering sticks brought him unto Moses and Aaron, and unto all the congregation. And they put him in ward, because it was not declared what should be done to him. And the Lord said unto Moses, The man shall surely be put to death. All the congregation shall stone him with stones without the camp. And all the congregation brought him without the camp, and stoned him with stones, and he died, as the Lord had commanded Moses. Numbers chapter 15, verses 32 to 36. This passage is crucial to the understanding of what the Sabbath ordinances demanded of God's covenant people. The violation of the Sabbath in so small a matter as the gathering of sticks involved the offender in a capital crime. Judicially, there was no distinction between this crime and murder. Both required the death penalty. The modern Sabbatarian, by citing Old Testament references to the Sabbath in support of his position, inevitably involves his position with this passage. He is required to regard the tiniest violation of the Sabbath with the same horror as he would regard the murder of a member of his family. All offences, from stick gathering through playing professional football, have to be seen as capital crimes. There is no escape from this situation. If the standards of Hebrew practice are worth proclaiming, then the requirements of Hebrew jurisprudence are worth enforcing. While our contemporary civil codes do not presently impose the death penalty on Sabbath violators, consistent Sabbatarians should not rest on the other 6 days of the week until the civil government is persuaded to impose such a sanction against the violators. If covenant law is binding, then covenant law's enforcement is equally binding. The man who deviates from this principle is, biblically, an antinomian. Any so-called, quote, humanitarian, end quote, leniency in the enforcement of biblical law is no less a violation of God's absolute standards of righteousness than the open denial of the validity of the legal standard in question. At the very minimum, based on expediency until our civil codes can be changed, any denomination or congregation that proclaims Sabbath law as binding must enforce Sabbath law on all its members through the process of the threat of excommunication. If Hebrew standards of Sabbath observance are in any way assumed to be applicable in New Testament times, then the churches must regard Sabbath breakers with the same horror as they regard, or should regard, murderers, kidnappers, and sodomites. The churches, as everyone knows, do not now, nor have they ever so regarded Sabbath violators. Paul went so far as to announce the doctrine that one man esteemeth one day above another, another esteemeth every day alike. Let every man be fully persuaded in his own mind. Romans chapter 14, verse 5. He did not say, it should be pointed out, that the day or days in question were something called Hebrew new moons or Sabbath days, as desperate Sabbatarian scholars have tried to argue. He simply said, day. Such an option of the Christian's conscience was not open to the stick-gatherers of Numbers chapter 15. This ought to lead us to the conclusion that the application of the Sabbath principle in New Testament times is radically different from what was required in Old Testament times. Similarly, Paul asks the individual Christian to decide. The ecclesiastical system that infringes on this right of conscience is an open violation of the New Testament standard. A church may enforce attendance at a Sunday service. It has no right to do more than this. The rights of the individual conscience in this particular case may not be infringed upon by any ecclesiastical authority. If the twisted exegesis of the Sabbatarians is accepted, and Paul's appeal to conscience is not regarded as applying to the weekly Sabbath, with the forced exegesis also applying to Colossians chapter 2 verses 16 and 17, then a major dilemma appears. Either the Church's standards of Sabbath-keeping are in flagrant violation of the Old Testament's far more rigorous standards, or else the hypothetically proper creedal provisions are presently unenforced, and have been unenforced for at least 2 centuries. More than this, it appears that they are completely unenforceable. The creeds are less rigorous than the Old Testament. The contemporary Church's enforcement is less rigorous than the creeds. The Sabbatarian who tries to escape this truth is deluding himself. Furthermore, what has happened in the case of the enforcement of these provisions, Old Testament or creedal, by the civil governments is vastly worse. The Sabbatarian cannot avoid this problem either. If he finds it easy to ignore the failure of the civil government to enforce the Sabbath laws, then he ought to be equally unconcerned with the state's failure to enforce the biblical laws regarding marriage, prostitution, homosexuality, theft, and almost everything else that the 10 Commandments might be concerned with. The man who takes lightly the state's laxity in enforcing any or all of these is simply an antinomian. If he believes that the Sabbath laws do apply, yet bothers himself not at all with the thoughts that the state has not done its job properly in this field, then he is defying the scriptural principle of law. A law worth proclaiming is worth enforcing. It should also be noted that a 5-day work week is an open violation of the Sabbath laws. The Lord did not offer anyone the option of taking a day off during the week. 6 days shall ye labor, he commanded, the AFL-CIO notwithstanding. Let's see the Church enforce that. The Puritans did. They were threatened with jail for preaching it or following it. They took that risk. The gathering of sticks is a fine example of Hebrew case law as applied in the light of a general requirement of the Decalogue. It shows, perhaps better than any other instance, the implications of the 4th commandment for the Hebrew nation. Consider the economic implications. What was involved in the gathering of sticks? Sticks could be used for at least 4 purposes. 1. Heating the home. 2. Lighting the home. 3. Cooking the meals. 4. Selling the sticks for uses 1 to 3. As far as actual use was concerned, the case in Numbers chapter 15 applied more to the daily life of Hebrew women than it did to the men of the family. It is more often the man and his work which are the focus of modern Sabbatarian concern, but this was not necessarily the case in a rural, pre-industrial community. The gathering of sticks was more likely to be the task of children. Women were to use them for household tasks once gathered. Men were to reap the benefits of both the gathering and the actual use of the sticks, but in general, they would not have much to do with the actual handling of sticks. There could be a few exceptions, of course, but the one exception seems to be far more likely, namely, that of the professional stick gatherer. His work would be most in demand on the Sabbath, precisely the day in which the prohibition against work was enforced. A woman who failed to gather sticks earlier in the week could buy some from a professional. We are not told that the man in Numbers chapter 15 was such a professional, but the severity of the punishment clearly would have made it far more dangerous for such a class of professionals to have come into existence. There was a need for a harsh penalty, men and women being what they are. There is always a delight in violating God's commandments if one is a sinner. If that violation also brings with it certain superficial benefits above and beyond the mere pleasure of defiance, so much the better. Sabbath prohibitions involved heavy costs for the obedient. Enforcement of the Sabbath required stiff penalties, thus burdening violators with high costs in the form of high risk. What were the costs of the Sabbath? For the man, it was the forfeiture of all income, monetary, less likely in a rural society, psychological, or in physical property for that day. But women also paid. They had to gather all sticks earlier in the week. It meant more work during the week, either in longer days or by increasing the intensity of the working day, or both. Had the working day not been lengthened or intensified, then other tasks which it was desirable to accomplish would have to have been foregone. And that, as any wife knows, also involves costs, especially if a husband or mother-in-law notices the failure in question. There would always be a temptation to forego the gathering of sticks during the week, especially if a professional would come by with a load of wood on the Sabbath for a reasonably cheap price. If his price was less than the woman's estimation of the costs involved in gathering the wood earlier in the week, a bargain was to be expected. By imposing a rigorous and permanent form of punishment on the violator, the community was able to force up the price of the sticks. Risks would be so high that few professionals could survive. How many women could or would pay the costs? It would be cheaper to buy them or gather them earlier in the week. Stick gathering was made an unlikely source of profitable employment on the Sabbath. Since the market for sticks on the Sabbath was restricted because of the high prices for the sticks due to the risks involved, the opportunities for temptation were thereby reduced to a minimum. It did not pay anyone to violate the Sabbath, and it was too expensive to hire someone to violate it. To the degree that the penalties are weakened in a case like this, to that degree it becomes a matter of conscience as to whether or not one violates the Sabbath or pays someone else to do it. Conscience stands without the protection of higher economic costs to keep a man acting in a holy fashion. In the mid-20th century, Rest on Sunday is based primarily on tradition and labour unions. Where these restraints are overcome, conscience is the only barrier against the violation of the Old Testament application of the Sabbath principle. Men who value leisure less than other forms of income will tend to seek out employment on the Sabbath, especially when the market is restricted, for one reason or another, against the entry of competing labourers. Overtime payments add incentive. If we accept the principle that it is wrong for us to hire another person to commit a crime for our benefit and his profit, then certain implications follow. Sabbath violations were capital crimes. If strict Sabbatarians regard Old Testament provisions as binding on Christians, then it is as wrong to hire a man to violate the Sabbath as it is to hire someone from Murder, Inc. to kill a neighbour. The execution of the crime and the guilt of the hiring party are in both cases equal. Capital crimes are major ones. If the Hebrew Sabbath is morally binding today, its implications and applications are equally binding. I have heard Christian people charge their fellow Christians with a violation of the Sabbath because the latter have dared to go out to a restaurant to eat after church services are over. The same supposedly holds for those who purchase food in the supermarket on the Sabbath. Why should this be a violation? Clearly, only on the grounds that it is a violation of the Sabbath to encourage another's violation of the Sabbath by paying him to remain open for business. If the standards of the Hebrew Sabbath are binding, then entering a place of business on the Sabbath is morally a capital crime and an abomination in the sight of God. Therefore, pastors and elders must tell their flock to refrain from entering into trade of any sort on the Sabbath. If a man wishes to take the standards even of the Westminster Confession of Faith, a pre-industrial document, it should be pointed out, in all of its pre-industrial rigour, then he should encourage his elders to enforce the provisions. Of course, the provisions of the Confession do not even approach the requirements of Numbers chapter 15, that is, the true biblical standards in the eyes of a consistent Sabbatarian, but at least they're something. If the creeds are valid in their 1646 interpretation, then 1646 standards of enforcement ought to be applied. If such standards are not applied, then it is a clear admission that the Church no longer recognizes as valid the 1646 definition of the Sabbath. Let us pursue the charge against the restaurateurs with rigour. Those same people who make the charge pride themselves on their Sabbath observance because they do not go out to restaurants on the Sabbath. They do not shop in supermarkets. They have stored up provisions to eat at home. Quite properly, if one is a Sabbatarian, for it is of the very essence of Sabbath-keeping that one store up provisions in advance of the Sabbath. But the Old Testament required more than the mere storing up of food. The passage we have referred to, Numbers chapter 15, makes it explicit that not only food, but the fuel was to be stored up in advance. Fuel for heating the home, cooking the meals, and lighting the room had to be procured in advance. It was a capital offence in the eyes of a righteous and holy God to gather sticks, fuel, on the Sabbath. The modern Sabbatarian thinks that his is the way of the holy covenant of God simply because he buys his food early. His brother in Christ supposedly is a vile sinner because he has failed to do so. But, under the provisions of Numbers chapter 15, both are equally subject to death for both have paid specialized fuel producers to work on the Sabbath. There is this difference, however. The man who enters the restaurant is not self-righteous about his supposed keeping of the Sabbath, and he has made no charges against his fellow Christians. He has undoubtedly violated the Sabbath provisions of Numbers chapter 15, but that is the extent of his guilt. The modern Sabbatarians I have met too often violate both the Sabbath and the commandment against gossip, or at least they indulge in the judgment of the raised eyebrow and clicking tongue. They neglect Christ's warning, "Judge not, that ye be not judged. For with what judgment ye judge, ye shall be judged." Matthew chapter 7, verses 1 and 2a. The very architecture of our churches is a standing testimony to the unwillingness of contemporary Christians to accept the implications of the Sabbath. We fill our buildings with all sorts of electrical appliances. We heat and cool the rooms to a comfortable 75 degrees, both winter and summer. We often pride ourselves in the efficiency of modern technology, forgetting that many men and women must go to work and operate the machines that provide the power, the fuel for our gadgets. These workers are committing Sabbatarian capital crimes each Sunday, and every Christian Sabbatarian who uses these gadgets, apart from some legitimate emergency, sends people to hell every Sunday, morning and evening, as he sits in the comfort of his air-conditioned church. If the Sabbatarian creeds are correct, then Sabbatarians are weakly condemning others to the flames of eternal torment, just so that they can sit in 75-degree comfort. Naturally, Sabbatarians can always defend a 75-degree temperature in the name of a vital emergency. It can be seen by some to be the equivalent of an ox which has fallen into a ditch. Freezing churches would drive away unbelievers in winter. Stifling churches would do so in the summer. Possibly this argument is legitimate if this really is the reason we heat our churches, or perhaps our bodies really could not stand what our Puritan forefathers went through to establish Reformed worship in America. Perhaps we could not bear churches so cold that communion bread would freeze solid. Possibly we would die if our present technological comforts were to be taken away from us, as apocalyptic pessimists have asserted may be a prospect in the near future. But if mere comfort is our defense of our power-consuming central heating systems, then we're not giving much thought to our Sabbatarian creeds. It has become altogether too fashionable to adapt the interpretation of the Sabbath to each new technological breakthrough. Sabbatarians cling religiously to standards written centuries ago, while violating the terms of those creeds regularly. It is schizophrenic. The wording of the creeds should be altered, or else Sabbatarians should alter their easy acceptance of a radically non-Sabbatarian technology. This plea should not be regarded as something new. It was made by one of the strictest and most consistent Sabbatarians in the history of the post-Reformation Protestant Church, Robert Mary McCheyne. He minced no words in his condemnation of his fellow Christians. Do you not know, and all the sophistry of hell cannot disprove it, that the same God who said, "Thou shalt not kill," said also, "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy"? The murderer who is dragged to the gibbet and the polished Sabbath breaker are one in the sight of God. Andrew Bonner has preserved McCheyne's teachings on the Sabbath question in his Memoirs of McCheyne, and the self-proclaimed strict Sabbatarian would do well to ponder what McCheyne wrote. If the standard of Numbers chapter 15 are still in effect, how can a man who proclaims the Sabbath escape the thrust of McShane's words? McShane saw clearly what the Industrial Revolution would mean. He challenged the right of railways to run on Sunday, but he was not followed by his Sabbatarian colleagues in Scotland. They chose, as Sabbatarians ever since have chosen, to turn their backs on the implications of their creed, while vainly proclaiming the validity of that creed. McShane has a word for those who today enjoy having others work on the Sabbath to provide them with fuel at reasonable prices. Guilty men who, under Satan, are leading on the deep, dark phalanx of Sabbath breakers. Yours is a solemn position. You are robbers. You rob God of his holy day. You are murderers. You murder the souls of your servants. God said, Thou shalt not do any work, thou nor thy servant, but you compel your servants to break God's law and to sell their souls for gain. Sabbatarians should heed McShane's warning. Those who stand in pride because of their Sabbatarian position ought to consider the implications of that position. God will not be mocked. When the provisions of the Westminster Confession of Faith are rigorously enforced, then the Sabbath debates can take on some meaning other than the playing of theological games. Then, and only then, will the issues be drawn clearly and honestly. When the elders of the Church begin at home to follow the Sabbatarian standards of the Old Testament, and when they impose such standards on their recalcitrant wives who love their stoves, their hot running water, and their air conditioning systems, then the non-Sabbatarian will be impressed. Let them turn off their electrical appliances or purchase a generator to provide the power. Let them turn off the natural gas, or else purchase butane in advance. Let them cease phoning their friends for Christian fellowship so that the lines might be kept open for truly emergency calls. Let them stop using the public malls on Friday, Saturday and Sunday so that mail carriers and sorters will not have to miss their observance of the Sabbath. Let them, in short, shut their eyes to the offences of others until the Church, as a disciplinary force, begins to enforce more rigorous requirements on all the membership, starting at the top of the hierarchy and working down from there. Let all the self-righteousness be abandoned until the full implications of the economics of Sabbath-keeping are faced squarely. Until that time comes, non-Sabbatarians will continue to be simultaneously amused and appalled at the shoddy thinking and self-righteous confidence of those who hypocritically call themselves strict Sabbatarians, but who are unfaithful to the very standards that they seek to impose on others. They are too much like the double-minded Judaizers of Galatians chapter 6, verses 12 to 13. The non-Sabbatarians will not be able to take the strict Sabbatarians seriously until the latter impose upon themselves the considerable economic costs of Sabbath-keeping. Until then, the debates over the Sabbath will remain a farce at best, and an embarrassment to Christ's Church at worst. Rethinking the Sabbath question will involve a rethinking of the whole of Western industrial civilization. It will certainly involve the questioning of the last 2 centuries of rapid economic growth. Strict Sabbatarians should at least be aware of the possible effects of their proposals. If the world should be conformed to Christian standards of biblical law, and if the standards of Hebrew Sabbath practice are, in fact, still the rule for the Christian dispensation, how would these standards be imposed on the population at large? Would it not make impossible our modern version of industrial, specialized society? In other words, if such standards had been enforced for the past 2 centuries, could this civilization, which most modern Christians accept as far as its technological conveniences are concerned, have come into existence? How much of our economically profitable, efficient Sunday technology would we be forced to destroy? The costs, I suspect, would be considerable. It is time for strict Sabbatarians to count those costs